the sense of pain in the previous sessions on discussing populism and, of course, specifically Mr. Trump. We're now going to travel a bit. We're going to go across the pond and look at the experience, particularly in Britain and in France. And I'm afraid that some of the key ingredients and some of the key themes are similar, and we're going to explore that. Of course, context and history always matters, so we mustn't be too obviously generalizing. But in our kind of exploration of the themes of this conference, I think we can identify some of the ingredients. I've been listening today, and we can identify the sense of anti-elitism against the system, and sometimes, as people have reminded us, with some justification. We can identify that both in Britain and in France. We can certainly identify anger against the system, anger against London, anger against Paris, just as people have identified a kind of anger against Washington, and the sense of emotion. And we can mostly definitely identify the inegalitarianism, the growing inequalities, the growing gaps with affluent areas surging ahead and less affluent areas falling behind. And this has been, I think, a very interesting theme of the conference today, this idea of the politics and economics of geography as a key underlying explanatory force for what's been happening recently. And also, as our speakers will no doubt talk about, is the theme of migration as a fuel for populist ideas. When I woke up with so many others on June the 24th last year in Britain, we all woke up with a terrible headache. That was the day that we discovered that in the end we'd voted for Brexit. And I'm afraid that headache has not gone away, just as you feel the nightmare of Mr. Trump reappears every morning when you wake up. And that vote, we've been talking about it quite intensely, wasn't just a vote to leave the European Union, though that encapsulated a lot of the kind of feelings. It was also a vote of protest, a vote against elites, a vote against the South, against those bankers who gave themselves £1 million bonuses when others had to scrimp and save. And so it picks up very much some of the central themes around. And I don't know whether Simon, I'll introduce our panel in just 1 second, will talk about Mr. Nigel Farage, but he, who briefly came onto the American scene to be photographed with Mr. Trump in his moment of triumph. You know, in a way is one of our original populists who fought for this to happen, and nobody gave him any chance of success. He's now off the scene, but it was a sort of 20-year battle that he fought as a populist. Looking over at France, we have to face up to the irresistible rise in some ways of the Front National, and I think our other speaker from France, who I'll introduce, Francois, will talk about the rise of this, built on a poisonous agenda, anti-migrant, nativist nationalism, and obviously making great sense of this egalitarian inequality, this collapse and difference between the rich and the poor. And at times I think that 25% unemployment amongst the under 25. So she was able to, I think the French call it immobilisme, the problem, the economic decline and the problem. She made much of that. And although we do have Macron there, we cannot forget that she got something like 11 million votes. She got 34% in the final presidential election, which was far more than her father did, and that was a real sense of crisis. I think it was back in 2002 when the whole of Europe was jolted by the figures. So there is a sense of crisis which is still to be solved, and perhaps it's too early to know which way and how Macron will perform. But these are the sort of background issues that we're now going to discuss. Let me now introduce our two panelists. François Bourguignon has been the chief economist and senior vice president at the World Bank. So we're very privileged that he has been able to come with us today. Former professor, former director of the Paris School of Economics, and currently Professor Emeritus there. And as you heard earlier in the morning, is the recent winner of the Dan David Prize. And he's written on globalization. And he's going to kick off first, and then he's going to be followed by Simon Head, who many of you will know, of course, as the director of programs at the New York Review of Books Foundation, who has been the chief architect of our conference, and of many others, and I'm very proud to have been involved with them. I'm representing the European, which has been one of the sponsors, and I come from Oxford. And Simon is also a senior member of St Antony's College, Oxford, where I am also. And he's written on two important books on technology: The Ruthless Economy, Work and Power in the Digital Age, and about machines, Are They Making Us Dumber? So with those words, I'm going to ask Francois if you will kick off for us, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to first thank the organizers of this fascinating event for inviting me. I was certainly happy to represent the Dan David Prize, which is co-organizing or contributing to this event. And I was also very happy to be asked to share my views about the relationship between inequality and populism. As a matter of fact, I spent quite some time in my life as a researcher investigating the issue of inequality, the measurement of inequality, the causes of inequality, and the consequences of inequality. And in particular, as far as the consequences are concerned, I tried to insist on the fact that this is almost obvious, that beyond some threshold, there is a negative impact of inequality, economic inequality, on the functioning of the economy. And one of the channels through which this may happen, which is not so much emphasized by economists, would be through the political channel, basically with rising discontent because of people being left behind the other people in the population. Then at some stage there will be some change or some pressure, some tension in the political system, which possibly will lead to decisions that will be bad for the economy. I tried to push forward this argument in a book on globalization and inequality, and as a matter of fact, I was suggesting that if inequality were to continue to grow in some key countries in the world, then we might have to be prepared to see some kind of backlash against globalization. This would go through protectionism becoming a priority of politicians, and to some extent we could say that partly this is what is going on in the US. I say partly because there are, as we heard this morning, there are many other things going on, and also we could say that the Brexit is also a very clear example of that. Now, what I want to do in my presentation is really to emphasize the case of France, which is, as a matter of fact, quite different. In the case of the US, there is no doubt that there has been an increase in inequality, very important one, taking place since the mid-70s or maybe the end of the 70s. And what is quite surprising to see that this is continuing over the recent past. So it is a kind of continuous increase. In the case of the UK, there has been an increase back in the 80s with, of course, the Thatcher regime, but then it stabilized with some fluctuations, and as a matter of fact, over the recent past, there has been some substantial increase in inequality. And in any case, also, inequality in Britain is much higher than inequality in the rest of Europe. It is below the level of inequality in the US, but much above the rest of Europe. So maybe we can also interpret the Brexit in those terms. In the case of France, inequality has not changed. Practically, when you look at the evolution of the most current indicator of inequality of income, and I'll come back on the fact that we are referring here to income, then this Gini coefficient has barely changed over the last 30 years. Maybe it has increased a little by 1 percentage point, but as our colleague and friend who passed away last year, Tony Atkinson, was saying that a change by 1 percentage point is not really something significant. And even when you look at the very top of the distribution, and you look at the top 1% share of market income going to the top 1%, then you find that it is different with respect to the UK this time and with respect to the US. Again, in France, there has been an increase, but the increase is really very, very small. So this raises the issue of what is, in that case, behind the rise in this populist party, the main representative of populism in France, which is the Front National. What is behind that? So what I want to do is first say a few words about the Front National and this surprising rise that we observed over the last 20 years, which accelerated enormously over the recent past, especially in the last presidential election. Then I want to say a few words about the inequality in France and the way in which we can try to think about what kind of inequality may be behind that rise in the populism in France. It probably is not, as I just said, it is not standard current income inequality, fine, but what kind of inequality? And is it possible to identify areas or definitions or concepts which would be correlated, at least over time, with this rise in the audience of the Front National over the years. And then I will conclude with a few remarks on what could be the future, and as Thomas has said, maybe a few words about the Macron experience. So let me start with a very quick summary of the rise of the Front National. The Front National was initially a right-wing, kind of neo-fascist, very small party with its roots in the people who fought in favor of keeping Algeria in France. So this was the Algérie française. Those people were almost by definition conservatives, and they were really very, very much linked to a kind of violent extreme right. Then over time, this group was able to civilize, if I can say so, because the Algerian war was over, but we still had a very high presence of immigrants from Algeria and North Africa in general, and then they chose the anti-immigration as their watchword, trying to convince people that there was a big issue in the sense that those migrants were essentially stealing the bread and the jobs of the French people. And it took some time, but in the early 80s it started to work. They had some audience. In one election, there was even able to get 10% of the vote. I think it was regional elections in the early 80s, and then they even were able to get 30 parliament members in 1986. And what happened at that stage was the fact that they were able to concentrate all the discontent that people in France may have had against the system. And today another watchword is they are against the system is not working, and we have to destroy that system which is not working. And people who voted for them are not necessarily people who believe in anti-immigration, and today in anti-globalization, anti-Europeanization, getting out of the euro, etc. These are people who are simply unsatisfied with the government that they have and are voting for this Front National because of that. I should add something which is quite important. In France, because of the electoral system, it is not very costly to do that. Why? Simply because we have a system where the elections are with a two-round majority. So you have a first round where you select the two best candidates of the first round, of initial candidates, and in the second round you have to choose between the last two candidates. Now, voting for one candidate which you know is unlikely to make it to the second round is free. And people were very happy to say we are unsatisfied with this government, and to show that we will vote against it, and we will also vote against the traditional opposition because we are not satisfied with them either. And somehow this is a way in which the Front National gained more and more power. But of course, at some stage, they were able to push people in the second round. And this happened in 2002, where the leader of the party, Jean-Marie Le Pen, the father of Marine, was able to reach the second round in the presidential election. And as Thomas said, he said he made more or less 16% of the vote in the second round. Since then, the audience of the party has expanded a lot. When his daughter took power, she was able to undertake what she called a demonization, is that the word? The demonization of the party, simply trying to hide the discourse on immigration and the most provocative part of the program of the Front National. And she was rather successful in doing that. And over the last 5 years, more or less, we have to admit that the audience and the electoral scores of the Front National increased enormously. And in the last presidential election, Marine Le Pen reached the second round, and she was able to have 33% of the vote. And in the first round already, she had 22% of the vote, which is, this represents a fifth of the vote. Now, I have to say that in the second round this time, and this is also one of the problems linked maybe to this kind of situation, the degree of abstention was extremely high. 40% of the people simply didn't vote. And in the case of France, in the presidential election, this is quite extraordinary. Now, this is the story of the Front National. Now, a few words about who is voting for this party. When you look at the map of the votes and you compare it to other maps, then it's very easy to see that there is a correlation, a spatial correlation with unemployment, with poverty. This is a correlation. This means that it is not because there is a high level of poverty in a district that automatically this district will vote for Le Pen. The correlation is very far from perfect, but there is a very significant correlation. What is interesting is the fact also that migration is not that important. Migration is very important because one of the strongholds of the Front National is oddly enough, is the Riviera. Because there are many, and as a matter of fact, there is a high level of presence of migrants coming from outside the European Union in that district. And this is really the only place where the vote may be associated with migration. In the other places, they are not especially more powerful when there is more migrants, and especially in the Paris area, where there are many, where the presence of migrants is more important, the Front National is not very strong. So this is the kind of thing we can say about their outreach, let's say, in the population, a few additional things are the exit polls show that people voting for the Front National tend to be older than the rest of the population. They tend to be less educated than the rest of the population. And the maps also show that intermediate cities, especially in the center of France, are voting more systematically for the Front National. And here it is a loss of importance, economic importance of those medium-sized cities in comparison with the big metropolis in the country. So this may be really linked to the internal migration of the people in France. So this is what we can say, I believe, to be very short on the Front National. Now let me say a few words now about inequality. So as I said before, inequality as currently measured, the Gini coefficient, the share of the top 1%, and other measures, will show that France is a country, probably as a matter of fact in the OECD, it is a country where the level of inequality is the most stable. So we cannot find an explanation of the success of the Front National there. Is it possible to find something else or to think about something else? I mean, the first thing on which I would like to insist is there is a huge difference between what statisticians and economists do when they measure inequality and the way in which people feel and are sensitive to inequality. If you ask French people today, what about inequality? What is going on with inequality? They will all tell you they are going through the roof and they are very, very high. And they would be very surprised if we were to show them the Gini coefficient. Now, this is not only in the case of France. If you ask the Americans what happened to inequality, there was a poll not a long time ago about this. A majority of Americans would say there is no change in inequality over the last 20 years, which we know is certainly not true. So this is the point that there is a difference between the objective evolution of inequality and what is perceived and the sensitiveness to that, to the degree of inequality. Some populations, some society may be more or less sensitive to an increase in inequality. And it would be interesting, but we don't have really the instrument to do that, to be able to measure that perception or that sensitivity. But we could do that possibly through opinion surveys, opinion polls, but it is not very reliable. But there are other ways to think. I mean, you can say that if people think that there is a lot of inequality, it may be because we are not measuring the right thing. And one obvious inequality that many people would insist upon is unemployment. It is true that people, in terms of income, when they're unemployed, are receiving some assistance, and because of that, this is not creating a lot of inequality in incomes. This is even true when they stop looking for a job and they say that they cannot work anymore. There is something like, there was a talk this morning, somebody mentioned something about the universal income. We have something which is very similar to there is a guaranteed minimum income in the population. So we cannot say that unemployment is creating a lot of income inequality, but it is creating an inequality in terms of social inclusion, in terms of the fact that people would like to work, to like to have a social life, labor or work being one way of socializing, and they're simply not able to do that. And they feel this as a very important source of inequality. And if we go in that direction, then we can try to expand or to think about other definitions of inequality. There is one definition which is the inequality of opportunities, the intergenerational inequality. And it is true that when we ask the opinion of the people, many people say there is something wrong in the sense that our children will not do as well as we did. And this is a concept of absolute mobility, in the sense that what is the probability that my children will have a real income higher than the one I have? And this is something which has been going down, as it did, as a matter of fact, of course, in the United States. Now, we can also think about this kind of mobility, but at much more, with an horizon much shorter. When you look at people who are living in those medium-sized cities with little job opportunities, except if they move or if they migrate somewhere else, possibly with a high level of unemployment, is it the case that when we take into account and try to aggregate all those conditions, we find that inequality in France has increased or not increased? I did something of this type recently, and I was extremely surprised to see that I didn't see any big change taking place over the last, I could not do it for a long time, but over the last 12 years, no big change. So I tend to conclude from this that the main determinants may not be inequality per se, it may be unemployment, difficulty on the labor market, and it may be the rate of economic growth, because the absolute mobility I was referring to, the fact that my children will earn more than what I did, depends, of course, on the rate of growth of the economy. So my conclusion out of this is say what is determining the success of the populist party of the Front National is really those two elements, which are not the conventional definitions of inequality, but which are extremely important. And when you look at the curves of unemployment and the curve of economic growth in France, especially when you look at the standard of living rather than GDP per capita, you can see that indeed there is a slowdown which is extremely pronounced over the last 10 years, and which could correspond to the rise in the audience of the Front National. So I think this is, at least in the case of France, what I can say. You can see that this is what I said is very close to what Engels said a little earlier in the previous session about the US. I finish with a few things about the future. Macron, as you said, as you know, was elected in the last election, but Le Pen did very well, and there is more and more this conviction in France that if Macron fails in reducing unemployment, in accelerating growth, then the next election in 2022 will be very dangerous, because this time the Front National may gain the final election. Two scenarios are being imagined. One is the case where the present normal, standard, traditional right is moving more toward the extreme, toward the Front National. And we observe something like that. People are moving away from center-right to the right. And this is the Parti Les Républicains, which was founded by Nicolas Sarkozy. And so they may be, at some stage, getting close to the Front National. And the Front National itself is continuing its movement toward not the center, but toward the moderate right. So it is not completely impossible to imagine that the next election, if Macron is not successful, will be with a right that will be much stronger, which might be a little less populist, but will still be populist. And from that point of view, I hope simply that we are not we escaped one danger, not to fall into another one within a few years. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
If we're looking at the consequences of populism for the economic and political, can you hear?
Closer.
Can you hear now?
Yes.
Okay. So what I was going to say is that there is something unique among all the nations we're considering in this conference about the role of populism in the UK, because in most of the cases, we are talking about populism as a force which can nudge the political system in directions which, from a progressive liberal point of view, we don't like. But I emphasize the word nudge, whether we're looking at what is happening in Hungary, where there is a kind of gradual evolution towards the party state, or whether we look and see what's happening here when the institutions of government are under stress from the populism of Trump or the faux populism of Trump, which are not seriously threatened. But I would argue that in the case of the UK, uniquely, the consequences of populism are catastrophic. The impact, the destructive impact of populism, as manifested in the vote to leave the European Union, is likely to bring on an economic and political crisis such that the UK has not seen in its modern history. And that is a dramatic claim, but I believe it's true, and I believe it on the basis of really quite sober and rigorous economic analysis. The key dialectic or the key determinant is the interaction between a populism which is not so different from what you find elsewhere in Europe or North America, but because it has become expressed in this vote, which has catastrophic economic consequences, is likely to produce a more virulent populism, again with a knock-on effect on economics. So the situation, and I speak as a citizen of the UK, it seems to me genuinely serious. I see it as the worst crisis we've had since 1940, but then we had great leaders, Winston Churchill, Ernest Bevin, in the wings to save the country. In the present situation, we really don't have anybody, and that includes Jeremy Corbyn. So let's start with manifestations of British populism which have been around a long time and which are not exceptional in the European or North American context. So that there are large regions of the country, the British Midlands, the Northeast, the Northwest, which are economically stagnant and chronically so in the manner of areas of the Midwest, and where the economic expectations of working people have been diminished. I think one of the things Angus has thought about is to what extent Britain is vulnerable in terms of deaths of despair that you've seen here, and I think one has to watch for symptoms of that very seriously. But clearly there is a long-standing economic malaise and a potential for populism in large areas of Britain, or of England, I should say. And related to that are currents of resentment against immigrants, particularly in the north of England, often Islamic communities who came to work in the textile industries, for example, just as the textile industries collapsed, and so there are very high levels of unemployment and a kind of social isolationism, which in turn gives rise to resentments among the British population. And then there is a kind of, and this is particularly true of the conservative universe in Britain, there is a kind of nostalgia, and always has been, for a past in which Britain was much more powerful, in which its relations were much more bound up with the former dominions, New Zealand, Canada, and of course the United States. So these are strands of populism which are not new in the UK. But what is new is that these strands of populism came together in the referendum to leave the European Union and became mixed up with a kind of mistrust of Europe and mistrust of foreigners, and resulted in the vote to leave the European Union. Now, why is this vote catastrophic? beyond the sort of regular policy discussions of think tanks and the press? Why is it catastrophic? And I want to devote part of my presentation to that, why it is particularly catastrophic from an economic point of view. And this ties up with the role of populism, because it seems to me that if the consequences are as damaging as I believe they will be, then by this malign dialectic, there will be an intensification of these populist strands. And at that point, you begin to worry about the stability of the political system, something which we haven't worried about in England for a very long time. So the key, I think, to understanding why it is catastrophic is to look at our economic history in the last 40-odd years. And I want to do that in a little detail because I think the perspective I'm going to present is quite rare, actually, and isn't presented enough. And if it was, we may not be in the mess that we're in. But very briefly, the French always talk about les 30 années glorieuses after 1945. And what Britain experienced in the really 40 years after 1945 was what one might call les 30 années médiocres. In other words, Britain was subject to a long-term, and really from the 1960s onwards, and particularly in the 70s, an accelerating economic decline led by the uncompetitiveness and disappearance of much of its manufacturing industry. Now, if we take the year 1979 as a pivotal year, we then get into a period which takes us to June the 16th, which marks the end of the period. And I call it two things. I call it the second long weekend, because if you're a scholar of England, you know that there was a wonderful book written by Robert Graves called The Long Weekend about the interwar period and the failures of British policy and above all appeasement during the long weekend. The second long weekend is defined by something which I will call the economy of the four free falls, or the four free loads, using rather sort of Maoist terminology. And what has happened in the nearly 40 years of the economy of the four free falls is that Britain, by no dint of its economic reforms or virtues, was subject to a gigantic free fall of money, of inward money coming in various forms, and I'll talk about them. And on the one hand, the economy of the free falls improved the macroeconomic indicators, but at the same time, it led the British to believe that the improvement of the macroeconomic indicators was a result of their own virtue, and that therefore it has led to, I would say, a consensual opinion that Britain was a much stronger economy than it really is, and that therefore the appalling risks involved in leaving the European Union have not been appreciated. So let me say something briefly about the economy of the four free falls, one of which was God-given, but the others were, to some extent, given by the European Union. The one which was obviously God-given, or was a force of nature, was the discovery of very significant deposits of oil in the North Sea in the 70s, which came on stream in the late 70s, too late to save the Labour government of Callaghan, but not too late to relieve Britain of the chronic problems on the balance of payments and the strength of the currency, which had been a feature of its post-war economic history. So you have the oil coming flooding in as the first of the four free falls. The second of the four free falls was that in the late 70s and in the early 80s, and something which has continued ever since, there was a very heavy inward investment in manufacturing by global corporations led by the Japanese, and particularly by the Japanese car industry. And this was geared to the fact that it's true to say that Mrs. Thatcher weakened the unions, which had been causing enormous damage in the 1970s, but also because the UK was a low-wage producer. This was before the wall came down. There was no production, capitalist production in Poland or Czechoslovakia. So the UK was actually a low-cost producer in relation to Germany and actually at that period of France. So there was this very considerable FDI, foreign direct investment, in manufacturing, which again was very beneficial to the macroeconomic indicators and also to the regions of the UK economy which were subject to this nascent populism. It did not make these regions prosperous in the sense that a region like Bavaria or Munich is very prosperous. What it did was to prevent an area like the northeast of England, centred on Newcastle, of reverting to the 1930s. So there's a kind of stability, but a sort of stability of avoiding the worst. But I would say that in the British Midlands and the British Northeast, foreign direct investment did perform that function. The third of the free falls is the one which is least understood, and that is the explosion of financial services in the City of London, which took place from 1986 onwards. And there is a great work of scholarship, which is essential reading to understand this, and it's the 4-volume History of the City of London by David Kynaston. It's a wonderful book. And what it basically shows is that the old-line British investment banks and brokers, which had existed since prehistory, were simply uncompetitive. So the Big Bang of 1986 was essentially the deregulation of the City of London. So income, Goldman, J.P. Morgan, Citicorp, and the rest, and fundamentally they sweep aside a lot of the British financial services companies. And the reason why they came into London on such a big scale is because they saw London as the location for attacking the European market. And with the development of the European single market and freedom of movement for financial services, London benefited enormously, but it's critically important to understand that the reason for this explosion was foreign capital. And the reason why the foreign capital came was because of access to the European market. The fourth free fall is what I would call disreputable money, because with the Big Bang and the explosion of financial services in London, real estate prices began to rise very spectacularly, and this began to attract a vast amount of disreputable money, above all Russian oligarchs, people from Hong Kong worried about Chinese takeover, people from Latin America, a gigantic infusion of money, which really has made London a kind of Potemkin city. I do not think of it as a great city. I think of it as a city which is puffed up by huge infusions of rather disreputable foreign money. But again, one has to see this as linked to the status of London as unquestionably a great centre for financial services. So that sets the scene, in a way, for the catastrophe that is about to happen. Because the delusion, the most significant delusion, which is very widespread in Britain, is that this infusion of money and the beneficial impact it has on the macroeconomic indicators were indicators of British success, to the point that the structural deficiencies which had brought Britain to its knees in the 1970s had to some extent been remedied by this. But actually they haven't, because the very chronology of the economy of the four free falls shows that it was foreign money and foreign enterprise which turned the UK economy around. So therefore, this delusion that it was actually British strength and enterprise has led the British to an alarming degree to underestimate the catastrophic consequences of leaving the European Union, because it begins to kill 3 of the 4 free falls. The oil goes by act of God, but the other 3 are highly conditional on UK membership of the European Union. And that is why the economic shock, if Brexit goes through as it is likely to, will be very great, and I believe much greater than British opinion yet understands. So one has to question the political consequences of that, and it's very relevant to the strength of populism. What if the economy of the 4 free falls yielded pockets of populism? What will happen with the economy of isolation from the European Union? What effect will that have on the extent and intensity of populist resentment in Britain? And I think that is a subject of real anxiety. So.
Okay. Thank you very much, Simon. We're going to open it up, but as you gather your thoughts and go to the microphones, I thought I'd add a couple of extra characters to the stage and see how our speakers react. I thought that for you, Francois, I might add the character of Mélenchon, because in a way, Mélenchon, as you know, is the leader of the Communist Party, also got something like 20% in the.
It's not the Communist Party.
No.
No, it's not. It's
It's
an extreme left,
yes.
but it's not the Communist
Sorry.
Party. No, they are. Like
yes,
that.
yes.
They are 2%.
Okay, so he got something like a very high vote, but what's striking about him is, in a way, some of his appeal is overlaps to the character and to the audience that Le Pen also appealed to. And I thought maybe you could explore how it differs and why, in a sense, one gets certain kinds of support and the other gets certain kinds of support. So that would be interesting. And with regard to Macron, I mean, in a sense, he's you spoke interestingly about the task he faces and the challenge he must succeed to prevent the doomsday scenario that you outlined. But here is an insider by preparation, an outsider in terms of coming from the outside politically with his new party, and yet he must break down this sense of grievance against the system. So it's quite a challenge for him. You might want to comment a little more. And for you, Simon, if I can bring on to the stage the character of Jeremy Corbyn, who you can tell me whether you think he's a populist or not. This allotment gardener who for 40 years has been supporting a huge variation of left-wing causes, and suddenly his moment comes. And now, as you probably know, he's the most popular politician in Britain. And some people see the more divisive the government Conservative Party becomes, the more possible it is that he might actually take power. He voted, he's a rebel, he voted 428 times, we're told, against his own party in various cases. And here he is leading the party and has had twice won the leadership in contests very decisively. I mean, his slogan is quite appealing, isn't it? He wants to build an economy that will work for everybody. And in a way, that does address your question of the free falls a little bit. So you might want to comment on that.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, about Mélenchon, of course, I mean, I forget to mention the populist on the left, because what is quite interesting, the fact that there is a lot of symmetry between what is going on the right with the Front National and Marine Le Pen, and what is going on the left with Mélenchon and his party called France Insoumise, or Rebellious France. Basically Macron took a position which is between the Communist Party, which is today almost inexistent anymore. I mean, they're almost dead. There are only a few parliament members. They got a very, very low score in the elections. And so Mélenchon wanted to simply not work with them because he knew that this line would not be successful with the voters anymore. And he didn't want to be involved in the Socialist Party, which was in the government. And in particular, the Socialist Party in those days was being in a kind of divorce, with one side being a social liberal, which was the Prime Minister Manuel Valls, and people working with him, and the other side being in the old Social Democrat tradition. And Mélenchon wanted to be left of the Social Democrats and possibly competing or overtaking the Communist Party. And he developed a very interesting campaign where he appeared to the people as the only candidate which was truthful to left ideal. And young people were very disappointed with the management of the country by the Socialist Party, which was not satisfied with the split in the Socialist Party, decided to vote for him. And he is a fantastic, he speaks extremely well. He's an intelligent man, he's very cultivated, and he did very well in the media. His campaign was extremely well led, and he was very successful. And he almost beat Marine Le Pen in the first round. And at some stage it was not impossible that he would be in the second round. Now the point that more than in the case of Marine Le Pen, I believe that the votes for Mélenchon do not represent an ideological shift among the voters. Basically because many people were dissatisfied with the management of the Socialist Party during the François Hollande presidency would not go to vote for the extreme right. Then the only possibility for them to show their discontent was to vote for Mélenchon. And Mélenchon capitalized on the discontentment of the left, and Marine Le Pen on the discontent of the right. Now, what is interesting is the fact that there was a competition among them, and at some stage they had the same watchwords. Both of them were against Europe. Mélenchon was not clear about whether France should leave the euro or not. Marine Le Pen was clear on this. But, and what is interesting is also the fact that Marine Le Pen attracted people traditionally from the left. I mean, we were talking earlier today about the working class, not knowing exactly what it means, what it meant, but it is true that workers in factories were extremely disappointed by the Communist Party, by the Socialists. At some stage, before Mélenchon became so important, shifted to the Front National. So there is a kind of discontentment front in France, which goes from the left to the right, to the two extreme, and we can say that there is a kind of polarization. But I insist on the fact that again, I mean, at the time of making a final decision about a president or about a member of parliament, then there will be very little success on both sides. And as a matter of fact, the parliament election which followed the presidential election was a complete failure for the two extremes, for the Front National and for the France Insoumise. Both of them sent less than 10 people to the parliament, which is really a complete failure. So this is, I think, the situation we are in. I don't think that there is very much future on the side of Mélenchon, but who knows? I mean, if really is able to attract most of the people who are disappointed with what is happening in the Socialist Party, why not? On the challenge that Macron is facing, so I mentioned the two main challenges, and he decided to move very quickly and to essentially on the unemployment side to introduce in France a flexi security system à la Scandinavian, so like in Denmark. So basically to say much more freedom for companies, for firms to lay off workers, but much more security on the side of the workers in possibility of retraining, of course the assistance while unemployed, and he's trying to develop that. The only thing is that I'm not sure that he is doing it in the right way or in the right order. He started by freeing the labor market, taking away substantial power from labor and giving much more power to employers. Of course, this was not very well, not welcomed by many people, and saying, okay, but later on we will have the security. Now, of course, people now consider that is more on the side of the employers, and we call them the patrons, the bosses in France, rather than the side of the workers. And he also was not very clever in starting with tax reforms, with a huge tax cut on the most wealthy people in France. There is a wealth tax in France, and everybody agrees, I mean, many people agree with the fact that this is not a good tax because it is distorting many things, and in particular this means that many people prefer to go to live abroad. But by suddenly cutting that tax, he gave back to the top wealth very, very huge amount of money. It's not that huge in terms of French GDP, but the impact in the public has been really bad. So immediately he was qualified as the president of the rich. But at the same time, he wants to improve the tax system so that there will be a gain by most people, but the order is not the right one. He started with the rich, and then he will give a little more to the middle class and to people at the bottom. So the problem, I think, for the moment, given the first months of his administration, is that he has, I believe, the right ideas, and he simply told people, I don't want to hear anything, leave me, let me have 2 years, and within 2 years you'll see that things have improved, and then we'll be able to make a judgment. For the moment, don't judge, but it is true that for somebody who was elected as being not on the right, not on the left, neither on the right, neither on the left, you know what Mitterrand was saying, that when people say neither on the right, neither on the left, as a matter of fact, they are neither on the left nor on the left. And this is more or less what is happening to Macron.
Okay. Thank you very much. Simon, do you want to, and then we should take the question there.
Yeah, you mentioned Corbyn. I don't see Corbyn as the Winston Churchill waiting in the wings to solve our problems. There's a very, very, very capable politician called Starmer, who's a rare politician to have had an illustrious career beyond politics. He was Crown Prosecutor in Britain, which is a high position, and he went into politics, and he's extremely capable. And he persuaded Corbyn to agree to this idea of a transition period between the UK leaving the European Union and a final settlement, which is absolutely necessary because the negotiations were in such a mess. But that still leaves open the question as to what the final relationship of the UK with the EU will be. And I'll say something about that because it brings us into the current politics of Brexit. There is a faction in the Conservative Party and in the Labour Party who sees the catastrophe impending and wants to do everything it can to reverse it, to have Britain as close as it can be to the European Union under the final settlement. But Corbyn is not one of those people. And the reason is for sort of old-fashioned socialist views which were fashionable in the 1970s, particularly by an old radical called Tony Benn, which put enormous stress on the state, the very active state role in promoting industry. I believe that the state does have a critical role, but it's very much, as I think Angus was saying, in, for example, bringing about spectacular improvements in the quality and productivity of the workforce, or in strengthening the research base for the economy, which you can do with research institutes, as in Germany. But that's not really what Corbyn wants. He sees the state as a kind of shoveler of funds to sectors which the state thinks is promising, and I don't think the record on that is effective. So on the supreme issue of British political economy, I don't rate Corbyn at all. Okay. I do rate him on the fact that he's picked up on a sort of profound social malaise in Britain, which is the situation of the younger generations. And they are hit, as is their equivalent in the US, by student debt. They're emerging from their studies with debts of £40,000. That's what, $50,000, $60,000. And they are faced with an acute housing crisis, which is worse than in the United States, because the UK is such a small country and space is limited. And so you have the ratio of earnings to property deteriorating spectacularly in the last 30 years. So it means that housing is increasingly out of reach.
Let's take some questions from the floor now. Lady there, waiting patiently.
Thank you very much. My question has to do with some of the last remarks that you made regarding political parties. Because it seems to me that the rise of populism also has to do with the crisis of political parties. And in the case of France, it was particularly evident, this collapse of political parties. I wonder if you can say something about that. And also clarify or talk a little bit more about this idea that Marine Le Pen has said that she would replace the traditional right in French political spectrum. Okay. So what you said is confirming that prediction?
Catalonia just decided to secede, and a word of support came from Scotland. With Brexit, what do you see as the risk of possible secession of Scotland, and what are the implications as well for relations with Ireland and Northern Ireland?
You're piling on the agony. Right. Thank you. Let's have a third question.
Hi, I apologize that I haven't been here for most of the day. I just came halfway in Professor Deaton's discussion, but I'm surprised, and I'm not so surprised with American scholars, but I'm more surprised with European scholars, which I'll for now include the UK, but that there's been absolutely no mention of the connection of nativism to racism, and the connection of the rise in populism to the concept of whiteness and white superiority. It certainly is a conversation that is happening, although possibly not in this room, in the United States. I wonder if it's extended elsewhere.
Thank you. Very, very good point. I'm rounding up a few questions because we've talked a lot from here. So is anyone else? I'm going to go back to the panel in a second, but if anyone's got a question, there'll be another round if my speakers aren't too long in their answers. Okay, so Francois, let's take the 2 points about Marine Le Pen and maybe the point about racism. I think it kind of connects.
Yeah. Okay, on the collapse of political parties, you're right. I mean, this is something I wanted to mention in my initial presentation. What is quite important is to see that the Front National is developing, to some extent, as a substitute to traditional parties which are being more or less dismantled. So this is certainly the case on the left, and during the François Hollande government, we could see the split which was taking place in the Socialist Party between people who were toward the market and were going toward a liberal view of government, and the people who wanted to stick to left values, old socialist values. And at the time of the election, the split was complete. And it is definitely the case that from that point of view, it will take years for this party to reassemble, if it ever reassembles. Maybe it will be something completely different. On the right, things are slightly different in the sense that the point, I mean, what triggered the problem on the right was really corruption. In the sense that the Front National was able to campaign against the traditional right, saying that those people were corrupt. This started with all the accusation towards Nicolas Sarkozy, was really involved in some very opaque operations for his election. And then, of course, the climax has been what happened to the candidate of the right, François Fillon, when it was discovered that his wife had received a lot of money as being an assistant of him being a member of parliament. And this is what made this election what it has been. If it had not been for that, Macron would not have been elected, and the traditional right would have won without any problem. What really made a complete change was this corruption. And what happened later on is because of this big accident in the history of the right, then they started to dismantle themselves, with some people saying, okay, we have to stay with Macron, and we'll have to collaborate with him and to be at the center where we always have been, and another part saying we have to move right in order to attract the votes of those people who without us would be voting for the Front National. So from that point of view, definitely there is a collapse of those parties, and now we have a new party, which is the party of Macron, which is not really a party, which is a movement. I mean, he asked people to join, and people were happy to innovate, and they joined. But there is no tradition, there is no party community that is absolutely necessary to function in the political world. So it is true that we are in front of this. Will it be possible for the two extremes to gain from this? I don't think that they can go much beyond where they are for the moment. On Marine Le Pen going to the right, I think this is definitely a possibility, because she now knows that if she wants to get to the presidency, the only way is to soften her discourse, to soften the program of the Front National, and by doing that to move towards the traditional right. For example, they just a few weeks ago decided that getting out of the euro was not anymore in the program, that they would be happy to stay in the euro. So this is really a big sign that they are really moving in that direction. Finally, about racism. Yes, I mean, you're right that at least in the Front National, this has been a very, very important dimension of the outreach of that party, with racism being initially very much against the North African, so very much against people with an Arab origin. And this is what is behind some of the Islamophobia that we observe today in France. All this is really linked to that tradition of that movement that was really started or put into movement, triggered by the Front National. Today, the situation has changed a lot in terms of immigration, in the sense that Marine Le Pen won to a large extent, because the the traditional parties, being afraid that allowing too many people to come in would reinforce the position of the Front National, themselves they restricted very severely migration. So migration is not anymore a big issue, basically because the government in place themselves decided by themselves to cut on migration in order to avoid too much publicity or too much support to the Front National. So I would say that today what is left is more Islamophobia, and this is also linked to the terrorism and all these things more than anything else.
Okay. Simon, on Scotland and Ireland, not too long because I want to take two more.
Yeah, I mean, the case of Scotland is very interesting because my talk was almost completely about England because Scotland, of course, voted to stay in the European Union. Now, to some extent, that reflects ancient Scottish history, that when Scotland was an independent kingdom up until, the late 17th century, it used the alliance with France to counteract England, which was a much stronger power just on its southern border. So there is a kind of openness to serious dealings with Europe in Scotland, which you don't have to the same degree in England. The other crucial point is that the Scottish movement for independence, I would say, has been undermined by the collapse of the oil price. I mean, the Scots have been doing the calculations of what they've lost from when oil was over $100 to what it is now, and of course the consequences are catastrophic for an independent Scotland. So Scotland is much more dependent on the subsidy from England than it used to be, and I think that shows up in the decline of support for the Scottish National Party. And of course the Scottish National Party is now the party of government, which it had not been for very long at the time of the referendum, so it's compiling a record, which the voters are judging it on, and in some areas it's not judged to be very good. So there's a decline which inevitably attaches to parties in government. So on the one hand, the Scots are strongly for remaining in the European Union, but that does not necessarily feed into support for the nationalist movement for the reasons that I've described. In the case of Ireland, I would simply make the point that one of the problems which seems to me to be almost intractable in the negotiations is the position of the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and it's an absolute condition of the EU side in the negotiations that it remain as it is, that there be no restoration of the hard border with customs and examinations. But the only way, it seems to me, that the border can remain as it is for the UK to remain in the single market and the customs union. So by agreeing to a non-border, if you like, they are agreeing in advance of the final settlement with the EU.
They're both, I mean, there's a lot of politics to play on both of those. And there is another scenario to do with ports, but let's not get into that. Can we?
Yeah, but that makes no sense.
Would you please?
I was in England when Brexit passed, and the British people I were with, we weren't at all surprised that Brexit would pass. And I remember when Ségolène Royal ran for president, it was the most vapid profile of her I've ever read. So my question is, between Brexit, between the failure to punish the bankers, between an intelligent way to deal with immigration and nativism and xenophobia, the left is constantly getting caught flat-footed. So the question is, why do you think there's been such a political incompetence and a failure of imagination and a failure of leadership in countries that are both doing economically well in Scandinavia and countries that are not? And I seem to see it, I've seen it in Britain, I've seen it in, we've all seen it. We don't even need examples. What's going on with the left?
There's two questions there. One, the initial point about the lack of surprise I thought was quite interesting, and I think one of the factors that emerged from the Brexit campaigns and debates and aftermath was that the two sides were really talking to their own supporters. This is a kind of a function of social media and the way we operate our politics. We kind of operate in silos. So what was extraordinary was that the people for Brexit expected to win, and the people against Brexit expected to win. And I think there was, as people finished the voting and switched on their televisions, what you say is very, very telling, because it was very, very interesting that we discovered that we haven't actually been reaching out to the other side. There'd been a huge amount of campaigning, but within the same kind of circle. With regard to the left, I think earlier on there was a very, I thought, telling contribution about how in the 1990s the left adopted a neoliberal agenda when it had an opportunity to return to a more social democratic agenda. And so people like Blair and maybe Mitterrand and Clinton, they called it the third way, but it was really taking on the Reagan-Thatcher revolution and keeping it. And that was the big lost opportunity. And I have to say, this is my own view, that there is a danger of that repeating. If you look at what's happened in the Austrian elections just recently, one of the major parties has adopted an anti-immigrant, kind of nativist agenda of the Freedom Party in order to neutralize what they felt was the extreme right threat. So there is a danger that there will be parties. I think also in some Scandinavian countries, some of the sort of right-wing parties have taken on agendas from the far-right parties. And I think there is a danger that people, and it might happen in America, where if they talk about the Trump people capturing the Republicans and making it extremely difficult for the, I don't know what you call them, the old Republicans or the normal Republicans. I don't know, we don't like them, but you know what I mean. Not being able to operate their own party.
I'd like to say something about the failure of the left, and particularly in the UK. If you look at two great moments of reform in 20th century history, the New Deal and the British Labour government of 1945, there was a tremendously rich resource of research and thinking which went into it. And in the age of rampant capitalism or neoliberalism, certainly in the UK, and really in the US, there hasn't been. There hasn't been a rigorous critique of what happened with capitalism becoming much more powerful, really, from the 80s onwards. And Jacob Hacker, who was here this morning, has written some of the best treatises on that. His two books, The Great Risk Shift and Winner-Take-All Politics, are critiques of how management and capital achieve power at the expense of the working population. And that, to me, should provide a rigorous basis for thinking on the left. But certainly, the British Labour Party is dismal on that. And I don't rate the Democratic Party much higher. But I do rate Bernie Sanders, because I think Bernie Sanders draws on certain currents of progressivism. He very much sees himself as a Scandinavian social democrat. He draws on the radical tradition of the New Deal. And he draws on something else, and I must mention this at this conference, because this is a name that's been absent, but it shouldn't be, and that is Saul Alinsky. Bernie Sanders learned his organizing techniques, and to some extent his ideas, from Alinsky. So did Barack Obama. He doesn't talk about it, but he was trained as an Alinskyan community organizer in Chicago. Hillary Clinton wrote her BA thesis on Alinsky, but Alinsky was a unique combination of a rigorous analysis of the economic system and a genius for organizing. So that's what we need on the left, and we just haven't had it.
I'm going to take the two questions.
Thank you very much for your very interesting analysis. There seems to be, throughout this day, there have been a number of different explanations and a number of factors that have come up that many of you have touched upon. But there's one that's come up, I think, from almost all of you, both as pertain to the U.S. and U.K. and France, and that's the factor of nostalgia. Is it important, and if so, why is it so important right now?
Thank you. And Simon just brought up Saul Alinsky. Many Americans do not know that in Chicago, Saul Alinsky in the 30s was aligned with a very unusual Catholic priest who organized the Catholic Youth Organization and extended, this guy was accused of being a communist by Father Coughlin. So I was wondering, in thinking about this, what kind of new kind of coalitions can we imagine as a positive way to get out of this?
Good question.
Okay, thank you. You want to talk about capitalism and then nostalgia?
No, yes, I will say something about nostalgia, but before that, I wanted to make a point linked to your view that there have been some opportunities for making different choices. And I think that it would not be fair to forget that in the recent election in France, there was a possibility for the left to win. And basically it required Mélenchon to make an alliance with the socialist candidate, which was Benoît Hamon. And together it was completely clear that they would be the second one in the first round, so that they would have been the running against Macron, and it was not completely clear that Macron would have won in those conditions. So what is interesting is the fact that this country went through a point where it was possible to reconquest the power for the, let's say, the traditional left, and they didn't want to use it. Basically because of rivalry between the two candidates, and because the socialists knew that if they were getting into an alliance of this type, then the Socialist Party would be dead, and because on the side of Mélenchon, because if he were to get in this kind of alliance, he would be absorbed by the Socialist Party. So it's interesting to see that history is full of such events of this type, where something would have been possible, but this opportunity was simply wasted. Now, on nostalgia, I think that you're absolutely right to mention that. Simon was referring to the 30, les 30 Glorieuses, which is 30 years after First World War, let's say until 1980, more or less. And the French people lived with this view that normality was the 30 Glorieuses. Normality was the rate of growth that we had in those days, was all the social institutions that were developed during those days, and that all what is being discussed at one point or another today always referred to what was done and what was obtained in this incredible period during which basically France caught up with the most developed country in the world, and in particular with the United States, caught up partly with the United States. So we knew that there would be an end of this, but it is quite telling that it is still a reference. And when, for example, people tell you, but my kids will not do as well as we did, this is something which is not normal. What they had in mind was really that period. They grew up during a period where parents were extremely optimistic about their kids. And they did very well. And they see today that they will not be able to see that with their kids. So nostalgia is certainly part of the story.
Thank you. A last word, Simon?
Nostalgia is absolutely central to the real hardcore Brexiteers. And it's a function, I think, of a lack of confidence and a lack of a leadership in Britain which has told the British that, or led them into embracing Europe. The only leader of recent times who wanted to do that was Heath, Edward Heath. He was not a very effective politician. He was in power in very difficult times, and he wasn't in power for very long. And his successors have either been emotionally against Europe or indifferent to it. And in the worst cases of anti-Europeanism, it manifests itself in terms of a completely surreal nostalgia, really for the period after the Second World War, the period of the Anglo-American alliance, when the white Commonwealth was still a meaningful concept. And with some of them, like Boris Johnson and Davis and Fox, they really seem to believe seriously that world can be recreated. And too many people in Britain are prepared to believe that, but it's a total fantasy.
Okay, now the last question, which neither of the speakers have, is one that's too difficult to answer, but how do we build a kind of progressive, inclusive alliance? I mean, I think that all I can suggest is that, as this discussion has shown, and the previous three panels, is we're facing some kind of systemic problem. It's the more we talk about it, the more we realize that there are structural factors, I think, to do with what I'm calling the politics and economics of geography, the lack of social mobility, the lack of actual real labor mobility. And we've got to try to get progressives to, in a sense, take the opportunity. Françoise was explaining how the left in France might have taken that up. We've got to take the opportunity and not look for the personal, immediate political gain, but for the wider gain, for being on the left to being on the liberal, progressive wing of life. Now that sometimes that's not easy to do if you're so determined to be the absolute winner. You've got to bury somehow the hatchet and join a progressive alliance. In Britain, all the polls show that 60 to 65% of the population are on the left liberal side. So in some sense it's extraordinary that we keep getting conservative governments, including very right-wing ones. So it's all to do with, not having proportional representation and divisions and poor campaigning and charisma. I wanted to introduce charisma. I haven't had time, but I think it's a quality that we haven't talked about. It's very important in this game. So, maybe I don't think Corbyn is Churchill. But I quite like the slogans that we have, which is, not for the few, but for the many. We've got to build around that. Thank you very much for your questions.